Let me down.
No, we can't, Vern.
I bought it, Wes. Go on. Go on, you're wasting time.
I can't just leave you.
You have to do that, boy.
The Western is America's most iconic film genre, but not all Westerns are about white hats versus black hats. In the late 60s and early 70s, something bizarre happened to the Western. Directors started dropping acid, counterculture crashed into cowboy culture, and suddenly we got films where gunslingers meet mysticism, violence meets surrealism, and the American frontier becomes a landscape for mind-bending exploration. These aren't your father's Westerns, they're your father's weird Westerns, the ones that blew minds during the Vietnam era and then vanished into cult obscurity. Today, we're diving into the 10 strangest Westerns ever made, the forgotten acid Westerns that turn the genre inside out. El Topo, the film that started it all. Alejandro Jodorowsky's bizarre masterpiece follows a black-clad gunslinger on a journey through the desert to defeat 4 master gunfighters. But that simple description doesn't begin to capture the sheer madness of what unfolds. Jodorowsky himself plays El Topo, a leather-clad figure who travels with his naked son, encounters a town where everyone has been massacred, and embarks on a spiritual quest that's part Western, part religious allegory, and completely hallucinatory. When El Topo first played at midnight screenings, critics struggled to describe it. Film critic Jonathan Rosenbaum later coined the term acid Western to capture its mix of mysticism, violence, and counterculture sensibilities. The film became the original midnight movie sensation, playing for months at New York's Elgin Theater to crowds of stoned hippies. John Lennon was such a fan, he convinced Beatles manager Alan Klein to buy the distribution rights. While Jodorowsky was blowing minds with surreal imagery, a young Jack Nicholson was already exploring the Western's existential side. The shooting. Before Jack Nicholson became a household name, he not only starred in this minimalist, existential Western, but also co-produced it with Monty Hellman under Roger Corman's low-budget setup. The plot seems simple. A woman played by Millie Perkins hires 2 men to guide her through the desert to the town of Kingsley. But nothing is as it appears. The dialogue is sparse and cryptic. The landscape is barren and disorienting. And as the journey progresses, it becomes clear this isn't about reaching a destination, but about an inevitable, almost predetermined confrontation. What makes the shooting so unsettling is how it strips the Western down to its bare elements and then twists them into something nightmarish. The film's ending is one of the most disorienting in Western history, a confrontation that critic Jonathan Rosenbaum described as the best Western Alain Resnais never made. Hellman wasn't done with the genre yet. He immediately made another Western that pushed the boundaries even further. Ride in the Whirlwind, shot back-to-back with the shooting on Roger Corman's dime, this time from a script by Jack Nicholson himself. Ride in the Whirlwind might seem more conventional at first glance. 3 cowboys are mistaken for outlaws and pursued by vigilantes. But Hellman's approach is anything but traditional. The film creates a suffocating atmosphere of dread and inevitability. The cowboys are trapped in canyons that feel like prison walls, dwarfed by landscapes that seem actively hostile. There's none of the heroic individualism of classic Westerns, just men caught in circumstances beyond their control, facing death with a kind of existential resignation. While Hellman was deconstructing the Western with existential dread, Robert Downey Sr. was turning it into a religious satire so bizarre it makes Blazing Saddles look restrained. Greaser's Palace. Robert Downey Sr. created one of the most sacrilegious Westerns ever made with this bizarre Christ parable set in the Old West. The film follows Jesse, Alan Arbus, a zoot-suited Christ figure who parachutes into a Western town controlled by a constipated tyrant named Seaweed Head Greaser. Jesse performs miracles, resurrects the dead, and tap dances on water while proclaiming he's passing through on his way to Jerusalem to become an actor-singer-dancer. Meanwhile, Greaser's son is repeatedly killed and resurrected, and a silent woman in men's clothing wanders the landscape. John Waters proudly called the film cinematic terrorism, and it's easy to see why. Downey came out of the New York underground film scene, and it shows. This is experimental filmmaking disguised as a Western, with little concern for narrative coherence or audience expectations. As American filmmakers were pushing the Western into absurdist territory, Italian directors were taking it in an even more violent, surreal direction. Django Kill, If You Live, Shoot! With a title like that, you know you're not in for a traditional Western. This Italian oddity, directed by Giulio Questi, makes even the bloodiest Sergio Leone film look restrained. The story follows a Mexican outlaw who is betrayed, shot, buried alive, and returns for revenge. But that barely hints at the madness that unfolds. The film includes gold bullets being surgically extracted from living victims, homosexual undertones among the villains, hallucinatory sequences, and violence so graphic that several scenes were cut by censors worldwide. The editing is deliberately disorienting, with quick cuts and unusual angles that make the viewer feel as unbalanced as the protagonist. While Italian filmmakers were pushing the Western into horror territory, American directors were using it to explore the counterculture's fascination with Eastern spirituality. Zachariah. Billed as the first electric Western, this bizarre film was loosely based on Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, transplanting Buddhist concepts to the American frontier. The story follows two friends, Zachariah, played by John Rubinstein, and Matthew, played by Don Johnson in his first major role, who become gunslingers but find different paths, one embracing violence, the other rejecting it. What makes Zachariah truly unique is that it's also a rock musical featuring performances by Country Joe and the Fish and the James Gang. In one memorable scene, a band performs in the middle of the desert while Zachariah practices his quick draw. The film's combination of counterculture philosophy, rock music, and Western tropes perfectly captures the era's attempt to reimagine American myths through the lens of 1960s values. It's a Western where the hero's journey isn't about conquering the frontier, but about achieving enlightenment. Keoma. This Italian Western came at the tail end of the spaghetti Western boom. Director Enzo G. Castellari and star Franco Nero created something truly unique, a Western that combines brutal violence with dreamlike imagery and a strange, almost operatic soundtrack. Keoma is a half-Native American gunfighter who returns to his hometown to find it controlled by ex-Confederate soldiers and ravaged by plague. What makes Keoma stand out is its hallucinatory quality. The film includes a witch-like old woman who may be death personified, slow-motion sequences that feel like fever dreams, and a bizarre soundtrack where male and female voices wail and narrate the action. While Keoma was pushing the spaghetti Western into new territory, American filmmakers were using the Western to examine the dark side of the frontier myth. Bad Company. Directed by Robert Benton, who later co-wrote Superman and Kramer vs. Kramer, Bad Company strips away all the romance from the genre. The film follows a young Union Army draft dodger played by Barry Brown, who flees west during the Civil War and falls in with a band of thieves led by a charismatic outlaw, played by Jeff Bridges in one of his earliest roles. What makes Bad Company so effective is how it systematically dismantles Western tropes. The wide-open frontier isn't a land of opportunity, but a harsh, unforgiving place where people starve, freeze, and die inglorious deaths. The outlaws aren't noble rebels, but desperate, often pathetic figures stealing chickens to survive. From this gritty realism, we move to a film that used the Western to explore themes of redemption through a psychedelic lens. The Hired Hand. Peter Fonda followed up Easy Rider by directing and starring in this lyrical, dreamlike Western about a drifter who returns to the wife and child he abandoned years earlier. On the surface, it's a simple story, but Fonda's approach is anything but conventional. Cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond creates some of the most stunning images in any Western, with lens flares, superimpositions, and slow-motion sequences that give the film a hallucinatory quality. The score by Bruce Langhorne combines folk instruments with experimental sounds to create something that feels both period-authentic and psychedelic. Captain Apache. Imagine a Western starring Lee Van Cleef as a Native American captain in the U.S. Cavalry investigating a conspiracy involving the phrase April Morning. Now imagine that this film includes Van Cleef singing the theme song, brief hallucinatory interludes, and Carol Baker as a saloon madam who may or may not be trustworthy. That's Captain Apache, a film so bizarre it has to be seen to be believed. The plot involves government conspiracies and an assassination attempt on President Grant. But the story is secondary to the film's strange atmosphere and Van Cleef's deadpan performance as the titular captain. What makes Captain Apache an acid Western isn't just its trippy moments, but the film's overall disregard for Western conventions. It's a genre mashup that's part Western, part spy thriller, part exploitation film, and entirely its own strange thing. These 10 films represent a brief moment when the Western, America's most mythic genre, was reimagined through the lens of counterculture, psychedelia, and experimental filmmaking. The acid Western might be a forgotten subgenre, but for those willing to take the trip, these films offer a vision of the American frontier. Explore our next videos and make sure you subscribe for the ride.